Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is me reading The Roar by Emma Clayton, Chapter 2. Hopefully this won't be in two different parts like Chapter 1 was, but I can't promise anything, so we'll just see until I start editing. Also, bear with me. I struggle with pronouncing some words, so might have some pausing and struggling to read some words here and there, but that's okay. So, Chapter 2, The Golden Turrets. By the time Ellie reached the outskirts of London, she wasn't thinking, only reacting to the maze of concrete and dozens of pod monsters coming after her. She and the pod fighter had become one, like an experienced rider on a well-trained horse, and although she was mentally and physically exhausted, she was flying better than she had ever done before, and gradually she gained a strong lead. They simply weren't good enough to keep up with her. London looked like a colossal, a two-tiered cake from a distance, the bottom layer dark and foreboding, and the top layer glittering with frosting of gold and diamond light. She soon realized her path to the shadows was blocked by a line of police riders, so she banked up toward the second level. The golden turrets of the new city were a melt of organic curves and elegant spires with open space between them. She knew she would be very exposed among them, and that the next few minutes she tried to cross London would be the most dangerous. "You might see her soon," said the man. "She's over level 2, heading directly toward you." "Is she?" Gorman replied grimly. She moved toward the glass wall of his hotel room and searched the sky over the city. It was almost 4 in the morning, and the thousands of luxury apartments were dark, with only a few air cabs buzzing lazily around them. Good thing, she thought. Imagine if the outcry of civilians were killed while his men were chasing Ellie. The glass began to vibrate. He touched it with his bony fingertips a moment later. Blistering roar ripped through the clouds above his head. He looked up and saw nothing but a few trails of agitated mist running in a line away from him. "I just heard you over me," Gordon said. "Yep, that's us," the man shouted. When she reached the outskirts of the city, she flew up in the cloud over, but we're on to her. She's not getting away this time. The noise faded into the distance, and Gorman stared up at the sky, wishing he could see more. Eventually he heard them turn and come back again, and a second later a two-pronged spearhead of a curved black metal and glass erupted from the clouds and flew straight at him at several hundred miles per hour. Instinctively, he took a step back and watched the raindrops in the window perform panicky star jumps as Ellie banked sharply, a few feet from his face up at the front of the hotel. There were 5 fighters on her tail, and they split to the left and right rather than attempt to copy her. Gorman covered his ears with his hand as the scream of their engines pierced his head. "Can you still see her?" he shouted when the noise subsided. "Yes, sir, we're driving her down." "Good. Get her to the turrets and force her down to ground level." "Yes, sir." The golden turrets began to light up as residents, awakened by the noise, turned on their lights and opened the curtains to see what was happening outside. "Looks like we have an audience," Gorman said. "Don't mess it up." "We won't, sir. I've got a feeling we got her this time. She won't stand a chance." Moments later, Gorman watched them drop out of the clouds, Ellie in front, with the whole squadron of fighters on her tail. He watched with his heart in his hands as she flew masterly corkscrew through the middle of the turrets, and then began a game of cat and mouse around them, giving a breathtakingly display of aerobatic twists and turns as she threw off the pack of her heels. Gorman couldn't help but smile as he watched his men trying to catch her. Time after time she slipped away, like a fish from their hands, to leave them flying off in the wrong direction or swerving to avoid the turrets. They couldn't keep her in their sights long enough to fire a single shot. She flew so tight a loop around the golden dome at the top of the turrets, the cleaner boards dropped off. Then a second later she stopped dead, and the men were all taken as surprised and overshot her. Gorman saw it all before it happened, and inhaled sharply as 2 fighters collided with another coming the other way, which prowled out of control and crashed into the building. Then the first two exploded in a ball of flame so intense it burned Gorman's writing nose, while the force of the blast shattered the glass in front of him and hurled him back onto the bed. His calm fell off. Still in his pajamas and slippers, he groped around for it with a shaking hand and pushed it back to his ear, where it lit up again. "Was that you?" he shouted, and his question was answered by silence. All he could hear was screaming from the streets below. He got off the bed and walked over the carpet of the broken glass toward the gaping hole where the window had been. He knelt down and peered over the edge, feeling a swoon of vertigo as he looked at the street hundreds of feet below. The fighters had broken apart on the impact, and they were now scattered in burning heaps down the length of the new marble arch. Every window he could see was shattered. People were pouring out of the buildings, and the sky was filling with the sounds of sirens. He tried to contact other men. "It's Mal Gorman. Where is she?" "We don't know, sir." "She'll be in the shadows. Send half the men down there, and the rest wait for her home in Barford North. We may need to kill her family. Make sure the men are careful not to be seen." In the chaos of the explosion, Ellie fled, devastated by the shock of what had just happened. She realized she probably knew some of the men chasing her. They had given her candies, or those little cakes she liked with frosted flowers on the top, or hollow pics of her favorite animals, or just kind words when she was doing well in training. And she just watched some of them go up in a ball of flames and crashed into a turret full of sleeping people. "But they were trying to kill me," she cried inside. "They're not being nice now. If they hadn't died, then it wouldn't have been us. And I don't want Puck to die like this. I don't want to kill people. I want to go home." She flew recklessly in her desperation to get away from them, and at the edge of the second level of London, she dipped sharply, turned, and flew into the darkness of the shadows. She was 6 when they built the second level on London, and she remembered sitting on the floor in her pajamas with her twin brother Micah, watching the pillars go up on television. She was eating strawberry stir and served from a bowl with bears dancing around the rim, and Micah was eating toast and jam with the crust cut off, close to each other, legs crossed, in the rare moment of companionable silence. The pillars grew before their eyes into the legs of giants with their feet in the city of sparks and their heads in the sky. They were hailed marvel of modern engineering by lots of politicians. "We considered all the options," the Prime Minister said, "and deciding that building the second level on London is the only way to cope with the flooding and overcrowding. Since we've been living behind the wall, there simply isn't enough space for everyone." "Mom, Dad, look at this," Ellie shouted, her eyes glowing with excitement. "They're going to build a fairy palace on top of London." Her mother turned to the television and dropped her muffin on my floor. "Oh my God," she said. "What are they doing?" "I told you," Ellie insisted. "They're building a fairy palace." "Not for everyone," her mother muttered, forgetting the muffin and sitting down to watch a model of the new city rotate on the screen. "It's only the rich who will live on the second level of the fairy palace, Ellie. The poor people like us will be left in the darkness below." Ellie hadn't understood what her mother meant at the time, and had been upset that they were disagreeing again, like they did about animals. But as she flew through the shadows and saw it with her own eyes, she was bested by gloom and realized her mother had been right. She wove around the giant pillars with the noise of her engine ricocheting like a cannonball off the metal ceiling overhead, and thoughts of the million people who lived in this slice of watery darkness with no sky and overcrowded damp buildings, some of them ankle-deep in floodwater, while overhead the rich were living in their golden turreted fairy palace. She knew the poor people lived that way because they believed they had no choice, and she also been told a lie, and that the world they lived in was not what they thought it was. "I'm going to tell you the truth," she said, "and Mal Gorman is going to wish he was never born." She needed a break. She didn't want to stop in this nightmare place, but her hands were shaking so much she could barely control them, and she was forced to land the pod fighter on top of a moldy apartment block with hundreds of broken windows. She turned off the engine, yanked off her headset, and for a minute sat in silence, listening to babies crying in the damp apartments below her. She turned to comfort Puck. He looked as if he'd been through the spin cycle in a washing machine and bared his teeth at her aggressively, his black mohawk extra tuffy and his bright eyes full of fear. "I'm sorry, Puck," she said remorsefully. She didn't try to pet him, knowing he wouldn't want to be touched. Instead, she searched for one of the bags of food. They had broken open and scattered all over the floor of the pod fighter. Popcorns and nuts, monkey chow and pieces of dried fruit. She scooped up a handful in the darkness and dropped it into his lap. She walked and picked through the monkey chow until he found a nut. "Better now?" she asked, as he inspected it with his quick brown eyes. He sniffed the nut suspiciously, but ate it. "Good," Ellie said, not feeling too bad then. She was about to get out of the fighter so she could stretch her legs when she heard the roar of engines from the south. She hadn't expected them to find her so quickly, and she was gripped by fear that melted into her seat. She didn't feel ready for the first time since she'd escaped. Panic overwhelmed her. She breathed deeply, trying to control her emotions, but tears ran down her face, and her chin wobbled as she fumbled with the harness and jammed her headset over her sweaty hair. "You have to be ready," she told herself, "or we will die." She fired up her engines and threw the pod fighter down toward the body of black water that used to be the River Thames, twisting west towards her home. She began to realize that flying through the shadows was a mistake. The buildings were much smaller, most of them built during the 19th and 20th centuries, where there weren't so many people. She had no cover apart from her monstrous pillars. In the darkness and within, she had a squadron of fighters on her tail again, and the air around her blistered and flared as bolts of laser fire narrowly missed her, blinding her so she could barely see where she was going. She could sense their grim determination now. Their mood had changed since she killed her colleagues, and they were baying for blood. She heard Puck shriek with fear, and she ducked and twisted, throwing the fighter into impossible maneuvers around the pillars. The face of her family danced in her flare-blinded eyes as she tried to shut out the screams by the terrified monkey behind her. She fought for Puck in the last moments, but there were too many of them, and she was too tired. "No!" she screamed as she felt the fire take a direct hit. The control panel in front of her sputtered light, then died, and suddenly they were in total darkness, failing like a dead bird toward an undulating mass of cold black water. Since Ellie had disappeared, her twin brother Micah had slept in her bed. Their room was tiny, the two bunks hollowed out of the plastic molding on one wall, with a narrow strip dividing them from the cupboards in which they stored their clothes and toys. They fought constantly over the small space since they were toddlers, especially over the bunks. Micah had insisted on sleeping on the top, and this drove Ellie crazy. "It's not fair," she yelled in his face. "You always sleep on top." "That's because I want more than you do," he replied, turning his back on her. "No, you don't. Stop yelling at me, Ellie. You're being a perp." Then Ellie would grab the edge of his cover and try to yank it off of him in a frenzy of rage. She would hold on fast, still with his back to her, both of them determined not to give in. "I hate you," she'd scream. "No, you don't," he'd reply quietly, which made her even angrier. "You love me. Don't flatter yourself. You stink. And by the way, Ellie, I'm the oldest, so the bunk is mine by birthright." "Only by 10 minutes, you selfish pig." It was only the intervention of their parents that broke up their fights. If they hadn't been threatened with starvation, sleeping on the floor, and never seeing the light of day again, Ellie and Micah would have argued from dawn to dusk because they were so similar. Both shared the same mix of Italian and Indian blood. Both had the same dark eyes, intense with passion and intelligence. As they grew, they became long-limbed and languid, by turns stubborn and moody, sulking in bed, then spirited and funny and bouncing off the walls with energy. "A right handful," said their tutor, Miss Fowler, with a withering look. "I don't know how you cope." Ellie's disappearance had shaken Micah so badly that even a year later he was gripped by the desolation he'd felt in the night it happened. But the worst aspect, as far as his parents were concerned, was his refusal to accept she was dead. Micah refused to attend the funeral, despite his parents' desperate pleas, and he stayed at home, brooding in Ellie's bed. And from that day on, he became so angry with her death was mentioned that he didn't dare to talk about it. He wouldn't let them wash her bedding because it smelled of her. She hung in the air like a ghost between them, and they felt as if Ellie died, so had a part of Micah. So they grieved for both of them. It was a terrible time, when it seemed like the sun had been plucked from their world and replaced by a black hole. Micah was certain Ellie wasn't dead. The police had told them just after she disappeared she must have fallen off the walkway and drowned in the flood water. But he couldn't imagine Ellie falling off the walkway. She wasn't that stupid. To accidentally fall, she would have had to climb over the barriers and the sides, and what's more, she was wearing a brand new sneakers she'd just been given for Christmas. She was so proud of them she yelled at him for kicking one by mistake when they were on the floor in their bedroom. There was no way she would have been climbing over the barriers wearing them, more likely avoiding the puddles so she didn't get them wet. Micah knew she was far away because he felt the bond between them stretched like an invisible cord until it hurt. He felt angry with his parents for giving up on her, and so distrustful of everyone who told them she was dead. The police, the coroner, his teachers, he hated them all, and he was existing in a no man's land, in the place that had been chosen to wait for her, and nobody else was allowed in. As Ellie was fighting for her life around the golden turrets of London, Micah awoke, instantly alert, with his heart banging in his chest. He sat up in the darkness, wondering if he'd been dreaming about her, but he couldn't remember. Ellie, he whispered, but he knew she wasn't close to him. He sensed something else, though something strange happening around him. He had held his breath so he could listen to the quiet nighttime noises and heard his father turn in bed and mutter something in dream speak. But there were other sounds too, which he knew were unusual for this time of night, and he strained to hear them. Yes, muffled voices were coming through the wall. There were people in the hallway outside of their apartment. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened for a while. He was unable to make out the words, only that they were trying to talk quietly, and there were lots of them, mostly men. He felt anxious and swung around on the bed so his feet were on the floor, wondered if he should wake his parents and tell them. No, he decided. He looked at the clock blinking at the head of the bed. It was 4 a.m. What was going on out there? There was a lot of traffic noise for the time of night, too. He stood up and walked quietly to the window, pulled up the blind, and froze with shock. Hovering only an arm's length away was a police pod. The policemen inside were eating hot dogs and dribbling ketchup on their legs, and it was a few seconds before they noticed a naked boy staring at them with bold black eyes. For a moment they were too frozen with shock. Then their faces flooded with guilt, and the pod zipped to the right out of view. Micah pulled down the blind in a panic and groped around on the floor for his jeans, with his heart pounding. Finding them, he yanked them on, cursing as they trod on something sharp when he pulled them into the living area where his parents were sleeping on a fold-down bed. "Mom, Dad, wake up," he whispered frantically. "There's something weird going on." They stirred. His father leaned up on one elbow and rubbed his face with his hand. "What?" he mumbled sleepily, with his features crumpled as if he'd been lying face down in the pillows. "There are men outside our apartment," Micah whispered fearfully, "and policemen eating hot dogs outside of my bedroom window." "Why do you think that?" his mother asked, pushing herself up on the pillows. "Excuse me. Are you sure you hadn't had one of those bad dreams again, Micah?" "No," he insisted. "I saw them. I heard noises and I opened the blinds. When they realized I was there, they disappeared. They looked guilty of it, as if they were up to something." His parents climbed reluctantly out of bed and pulled on their bathrobes. "Look out of the window, David," his mother said, her eyes glittering in the darkness. His father huffed impatiently, as if he thought he was wasting his time. He opened the curtains and peered through a gap in the blind. He was quiet for a few moments, and Micah stood beside him, breathing hard and wondering why he felt so afraid. "There's nothing out there, Micah," he said at last. "Look for yourself." He raised the blind so Micah could see out. His mother put a comforting hand on his shoulder as they looked out at nothing but blackened concrete, rolling clouds, and rain. "Yeah, but I told you," Micah insisted. "When they saw me, they flew off. Look outside the door. I could hear them talking." He shrugged off his mother's hand and felt a similar wave of frustration and anger because his parents didn't believe him. "Okay," his father said calmly, shooting his wife a meaningful look. He looked around the side of the bed toward the door. "No, don't," Micah said, changing his mind as he felt a surge of foreboding. His father paused. "Why are you so afraid?" he said. "Even if there are people out there, I'm sure there's perfectly normal explanation for it." "I don't know," Micah replied, feeling confused. "I just do." "Come on," Asher said comfortingly. "Let's look, and then you can go back to bed without worrying about it." The door slid open, flooding the tiny apartment with dim yellow light and cold air. His father shrugged and stepped out into the empty hallway. "Come and see for yourself," he said, and the three of them stood in the hallway of their bare feet cold on the dirty concrete floor, seeing nothing but a line of silent doors and mildew-stained walls. But only a few feet away from them, hiding in the stairwell and the elevator, were the men Mal Gorman had sent to watch their apartment. 30 men with their fingers twitching on the triggers of their gun, waiting for the order to kill. "Let's go back in," Asha said, looking down at the empty hallway with her teeth chattering. "It's freezing out here and you've got to get up for school in 3 hours. Micah lay rigid in his bed and his mother attempted to tuck him in. He'd wish she'd stop fussing over him as if he were a child, and he felt angry too. They'd made him feel like a fool because there was nobody in the hallway. "Have you been eating noodles in bed?" his mother asked, eyeing the red splotches on Ellie's cover with distaste. "Yes," he replied hotly, turning his back on her and hugging the filthy cover. It's going to have to be washed, Micah." "No," he said adamantly. "But it doesn't smell of her anymore," she replied, impatient with fatigue. "It just smells of your feet and noodle juice." "Yes, it does smell of Ellie," he said, turning over again to glare at her, "and I don't want it washed until she comes home." Asha was a beautiful woman from 50. Her Indian blood had given her the fine bones and dark hair and eyes her children had inherited. But she also looked into Micah's face and felt the heat of his anger and pain. She felt herself wither like a tree receiving the first kiss of a forest fire. "Stop it," she said sharply. "Ellie has been dead for a year, and the sooner you accept it, the sooner we can all move on. It's not fair, Micah." "No," Micah said quietly, tears pressing in his eyes. "It's you that's wrong. She's not dead. I can feel her." He felt her more than he knew, as Ellie's pod fighter shot down and fell into the dark water of the shadows. He felt as if he'd received a crushing blow to his chest. He tried to cry out, but there was nothing to cry with. There was no air in his lungs, and he couldn't breathe in. Blind with panic, he managed to turn himself over in the bed, desperate for his mother's help. But although he wanted to move and speak, he felt pressure pushing down on him from above, a weight of cold darkness pressing him down. He lay paralyzed, listening to a terrible noise, unaware he was making it, a rasping as if his windpipe had been cut, and was falling into darkness, freezing cold. "Micah!" Asha cried, leaning forward to grab his shoulders. "What's wrong?" He was unable to reply, and his black eyes pleaded with her to save him. "David!" she screamed. "Call an ambulance!" That is all for Chapter 2. Thank you so much for listening. I wouldn't say watching, but thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications for when I do post more chapters of this. That is all. Bye bye.